The autumn leaves crunched beneath my feet as I walked toward the house that had been my prison for 43 years. Not a literal prison, mind you, but the kind that builds itself around you so slowly, so quietly, that you don't realize you're trapped until the walls are already sky-high and the door has been locked from the inside. I paused at the front gate, my hand trembling slightly as I gripped the cold metal. The house looked exactly the same as it had this morning when I'd left for what I thought would be just another grocery run. Same peeling paint on the shutters that I'd been meaning to fix for months. Same overgrown hedge that needed trimming. Same sense of suffocating responsibility that seemed to seep from every brick and board. But I wasn't the same. Before we begin, make sure to like and subscribe, and please tell me and others, what's one life lesson everyone should hear before it's too late? Share it in the comments below. Thanks. The letter in my coat pocket felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. 3 pages of careful handwriting that would change everything. 3 pages that would either set me free or destroy what was left of my family. Maybe both. I'd been standing there for 10 minutes when I heard the familiar rumble of Donald's truck pulling into the driveway. My eldest son, 42 years old and still expecting his mother to solve every problem that crossed his path. Behind him came Jane's minivan, packed with my 3 grandchildren who would undoubtedly be hungry, cranky, and in need of entertainment while the adults talked about adult things. "Mom!" Jane called out as she struggled to extract her youngest from his car seat. "Thank God you're here. I've had the worst day, and the kids have been impossible, and I really need you to watch them while I run to the pharmacy. Tommy's been throwing up all morning, and I think it might be that stomach bug that's been going around, and..." "Hello to you too, sweetheart," I said quietly, but she was already moving past me toward the front door, assuming I would follow, assuming I would help, assuming I would drop whatever plans I might have had to accommodate her crisis. Donald was pulling grocery bags from his truck bed, the expensive organic kind that I knew he couldn't really afford but bought anyway because his wife insisted their family only ate clean food. He'd be asking for money again soon. He always did when the bags were that expensive. "Hey, Mom," he grunted, not looking at me. "Can you grab some of these? My back's been killing me, and Dr. Peterson says I need to avoid heavy lifting." I watched my children move around me like I was a piece of furniture. Useful furniture, mind you, but furniture nonetheless. Jane was already at the front door, jiggling the handle impatiently. Donald was stacking bags on the ground, clearly expecting me to carry them inside. The grandchildren were spilling out of the minivan like puppies, loud and demanding and completely unaware that their grandmother might be anything more than a convenient source of snacks and entertainment. This was my life. This had been my life for so long that I'd forgotten there might be any other way to live. But today was different. Today, I had the letter. "Actually," I said, my voice cutting through the chaos with an unfamiliar firmness, "I need to talk to you both. Inside. Now." Something in my tone made them stop. Jane turned from the door, her hand still on the handle, her face already arranging itself into that expression of patient martyrdom she wore whenever anyone dared to inconvenience her. Donald straightened up from the grocery bags, his eyebrows raised in surprise. "Mom, can it wait?" Jane asked. "I really need to get to the pharmacy before they close, and Tommy's been..." "No," I said. "It can't wait." I walked past them to the front door, fishing my keys from my purse with hands that were steadier than I'd expected. Behind me, I could hear them exchanging glances, could feel their confusion and irritation radiating like heat from a fire. Good. Let them be confused. Let them wonder what was happening to their reliable, predictable mother who never said no, never made demands, never put her own needs first. The house smelled like the pot roast I'd put in the slow cooker that morning, back when I'd still been planning to feed everyone, back when I'd still been planning to be the same woman I'd been for the past 4 decades. The familiar scent made my stomach clench with something that might have been grief. "Kids, go wash your hands and turn on the TV," I told my grandchildren as they tumbled through the door. There are crackers in the kitchen if you're hungry. They scattered like leaves in the wind, already forgetting that their grandmother existed now that they had access to screens and snacks. At least they were honest about using me. Donald and Jane followed me into the living room, Donald still carrying one of his precious organic grocery bags, Jane checking her phone with the frantic energy of someone who believed the world would end if she wasn't constantly available to manage everyone else's problems. "Sit down," I said. They sat, but reluctantly, perched on the edge of the couch like birds ready to take flight at the first opportunity. Jane kept glancing toward the kitchen where her children were, already mentally calculating how long this conversation would take and whether she'd still have time for all her errands. I remained standing, looking down at these two people I'd given birth to, raised, sacrificed for, worried about, and loved with a fierce intensity that had consumed most of my adult life. They looked back at me with expressions of polite impatience, waiting for me to say whatever I needed to say so they could get back to the important business of their own lives. "I'm leaving," I said. The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire that had just been lit. Jane's phone slipped from her fingers and clattered onto the coffee table. Donald's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. "Leaving?" Jane was the first to find her voice. "What do you mean, leaving? Leaving for where?" I pulled the letter from my coat pocket and set it on the coffee table between us. 3 pages of careful handwriting that had taken me 6 hours to compose, rewrite, and perfect. 6 hours of pouring 43 years of suppressed feelings onto paper. "I mean leaving," I said. "This house, this town, this life where I exist only to solve your problems and meet your needs while my own dreams collect dust in the corners of my heart." Donald leaned forward and picked up the letter, his face growing paler with each line he read. Jane snatched it from his hands when he was finished, her eyes scanning the pages with increasing disbelief. "This is ridiculous," she said finally, throwing the letter back onto the table. "You can't just leave. What about the kids? What about Dad's medical appointments? What about me?" I interrupted, and the sharpness in my voice surprised all 3 of us. "What about what I want? What about what I need? What about the fact that I'm 65 years old and I've spent the last 43 years of my life being everyone's solution to everything, and I'm tired?" "But Mom," Donald said, his voice taking on that wheedling tone he'd used as a child when he wanted something, "you can't just abandon us. We need you. You need my services," I corrected. "You need someone to babysit your children and cook your meals and loan you money and listen to your problems and clean up your messes. But you don't need me. You don't even see me." Jane's face was flushing red, the way it always did when she was about to lose her temper. "That's not fair, Mom. We love you. We appreciate everything you do. Do you?" I asked. "When was the last time either of you asked me how I was doing? Not how I was feeling about your problems or whether I was available to help with your latest crisis, but how I was doing. When was the last time you remembered my birthday without Facebook reminding you? When was the last time you called just to talk, not because you needed something?" They stared at me in silence, and I could see the wheels turning in their heads, searching for examples that we all knew didn't exist. "I thought so," I said softly. From the kitchen came the sound of my grandchildren arguing over the remote control, their voices rising in the familiar crescendo that usually sent me hurrying to mediate. Today, I stayed where I was. "So what, you're just going to disappear?" Donald asked, and I could hear the panic creeping into his voice. "What about Jane's work conference next week? What about hiring a babysitter?" I suggested. "What about taking time off work to handle your own responsibilities? What about figuring out how to manage your lives without using me as a crutch?" Jane stood up abruptly, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "I can't believe you're being so selfish. We're your family. Family helps each other." "You're right," I said. "Family does help each other. But for the past 43 years, the help has only flowed in one direction. I've given and given and given until there's nothing left of me but an empty shell that exists to serve everyone else's needs. I walked to the mantelpiece and picked up a framed photo of all of us from last Christmas. In the picture, I was smiling, but looking at it now, I could see the exhaustion in my eyes, the way my shoulders sagged under the weight of invisible burdens. "Look at this picture," I said, holding it out to them. "Really look at it. What do you see?" They glanced at the photo reluctantly. "I see a family," Jane said defensively. "I see a woman who's disappearing," I said. "I see someone who's been so busy taking care of everyone else that she's forgotten who she is underneath all the roles she plays. Mother, grandmother, caretaker, problem solver, bank account with legs." Donald winced at that last one, and I knew he was thinking about the $3,000 he'd borrowed last month for his truck repairs. Money he'd promised to pay back but that we both knew he never would. "The woman in this picture is dying," I continued. "She's been dying slowly for years, suffocating under the weight of everyone else's expectations. And if I don't leave now, if I don't save what's left of her, she'll be gone completely, and there will be nothing left but a ghost who goes through the motions of living while feeling nothing at all." The room fell silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner, the one that had belonged to my mother and that I'd wound faithfully every week for the past 20 years. Even that felt like another responsibility, another thing that would fall apart if I wasn't there to maintain it. "Where will you go?" Donald asked quietly. "I don't know yet," I admitted. "Maybe I'll travel. Maybe I'll move to the coast and learn to paint. Maybe I'll volunteer at an animal shelter or take cooking classes or write the novel I've been thinking about for 30 years. Maybe I'll just sit on a beach somewhere and remember what it feels like to exist without anyone needing anything from me." "But what about money?" Jane asked, ever practical. "You can't just live on Social Security." I smiled, and it felt strange on my face, like a muscle I'd forgotten how to use. "I've been saving for this for longer than you know. Every birthday check from your grandmother that I never spent on myself, every tax refund that didn't go to one of your emergencies, every penny I could scrape together from my part-time job at the library. I have enough." The truth was, I had more than enough. I'd been planning this escape for 5 years, ever since the day I'd realized that my children saw me not as a person but as a resource to be exploited. I'd opened a secret bank account, one they knew nothing about, and I'd been feeding it steadily, preparing for the day when I would finally have the courage to use it. "This is insane," Jane said, but her voice lacked conviction now. "You can't just start over at 65. "Why not?" I asked. "Who made that rule? Who decided that once you become a mother, you stop being anything else? Who decided that once your children are grown, your only purpose is to be available for their convenience?" I walked to the window and looked out at the street where I'd lived for 23 years, where I'd raised my children and buried my husband and slowly lost myself in the process of being everything to everyone. "Your father and I used to talk about traveling," I said, my voice softer now. "We had plans. We were going to see the Grand Canyon and visit New England in the fall and maybe even take a cruise to Alaska. But there was always something more important. Your college tuition, Donald. Your wedding, Jane. The grandchildren's needs. Dad's illness. There was always a reason to put our dreams on hold." I turned back to face them, and I could see that they were really looking at me now, maybe for the first time in years. "He died without ever seeing the Grand Canyon," I said. "He died in a hospital bed, surrounded by machines and the smell of disinfectant, and his last words to me were, 'I'm sorry we never made it to Alaska.' I promised him then that I wouldn't make the same mistake. I promised him that I would live, really live, while I still had time." Donald's eyes were bright with unshed tears, and I felt a pang of guilt that I quickly pushed away. I'd spent too many years letting guilt control my decisions. "But what about us?" he asked, and for a moment he sounded like the little boy he'd once been, the one who'd crawled into my bed during thunderstorms and believed I could protect him from anything. You'll be fine, I said, and I meant it. You're both strong, capable adults. You've just forgotten how to be independent because it's been easier to let me handle things. But you'll remember. You'll have to. From the kitchen came a crash, followed by the sound of one of my grandchildren crying. Jane started to get up, then looked at me expectantly. Go ahead, I said. Handle it. Practice for when I'm not here. She hesitated for a moment, then walked toward the kitchen, her steps uncertain. She wasn't used to being the one who fixed things, the one who cleaned up messes, the one who soothed hurt feelings. But she would learn. Donald was still staring at the letter on the coffee table, as if he could make it disappear through sheer force of will. When? He asked. Tomorrow morning, I said. I've already packed. My bags are in the bedroom. Tomorrow. His voice cracked. But that's so soon. Can't we talk about this? Can't we work something out? I sat down beside him on the couch, close enough to smell his familiar scent of aftershave and anxiety. Donald, I said gently, if I don't leave tomorrow, I'll never leave. I'll find excuses, reasons to stay, problems that need solving. I'll convince myself that I'm indispensable, that you can't survive without me. And maybe that's true right now, but it shouldn't be. It's not healthy for any of us. He was quiet for a long moment, and I could hear Jane in the kitchen, her voice high and strained as she tried to calm whatever crisis had erupted among the children. I never realized, he said finally. I never thought about how hard it must be for you, always being the one everyone turns to. I know, I said. And that's part of the problem. I made it look easy because I wanted to be a good mother, a good grandmother. I wanted to be needed. But somewhere along the way, being needed became being used, and I lost myself in the process. Jane returned from the kitchen, a wet paper towel in her hand and a look of frazzled exhaustion on her face. Tommy spilled his juice all over the floor, she said, as if this were a catastrophe of epic proportions. And now Katie's crying because she wanted the blue cup, not the red one, and Michael's being mean to both of them. She looked at me expectantly, waiting for me to spring into action, to fix the situation with the magical mother powers she'd always taken for granted. Sounds like you handled it, I said calmly. But they're still upset, she protested. You're so much better at dealing with them when they're like this. I'm better at it because I've had more practice, I said. But you're their mother, Jane. They need to learn that you're the one in charge, not me. She stared at me for a moment, then sank back onto the couch, looking defeated. I don't know how to do this without you, she admitted, and for the first time in years, I heard genuine vulnerability in her voice instead of just demands and expectations. Yes, you do, I said. You just haven't had to try because I've always been here to do it for you. But you raised those children for the first few years of their lives before I became so involved. You know how to be their mother. But it's so much easier with your help, she said, and I could hear the whine creeping back into her voice. Easier for you, I said. But not better for them, and definitely not better for me. I stood up and walked to the bookshelf where I kept the photo albums, pulling out the one from Jane's childhood. I flipped through the pages until I found what I was looking for, a picture of Jane at age 7, standing proudly beside a lopsided birthday cake she'd made for her father. Do you remember this? I asked, showing her the photo. She looked at it and smiled despite herself. I was so proud of that cake. It tasted terrible, but Dad ate 2 pieces and said it was the best birthday cake he'd ever had. You made that cake by yourself, I said. You were 7 years old, and you wanted to do something special for your father, so you figured out how to do it. You didn't ask for help. You didn't wait for someone else to solve the problem. You just did it. I closed the album and set it back on the shelf. That little girl is still inside you, Jane. The one who was brave enough to try new things, who was proud of her accomplishments even when they weren't perfect. But she's been buried under years of having someone else handle the difficult parts of life. Jane was crying now, quiet tears that she wiped away with the back of her hand. I'm scared, she whispered. What if I can't do it? What if I mess up? Then you'll mess up, I said simply. And then you'll figure out how to fix it, or you'll try again, or you'll find a different way. That's what adults do. That's what parents do. Donald had been quiet during this exchange. The grandfather clock chimed 6 times, and I realized that this conversation had been going on for over an hour. In the kitchen, the children had grown quiet, probably absorbed in whatever show they'd found on television. I need to start dinner, Jane said automatically, then caught herself. I mean, I should probably get the kids home and figure out what to feed them. That sounds like a good plan, I said. She looked at me for a moment, as if waiting for me to offer to cook for them, to invite them to stay, to slip back into the familiar role of the mother who solved all problems and met all needs. When I didn't, she stood up slowly. Come on, kids, she called toward the kitchen. Time to go home. The children emerged reluctantly, their faces sticky with whatever snacks they'd found, their clothes rumpled from playing. But Grandma always makes us dinner on Sundays, Katie protested. And she promised to help me with my science project. Grandma has other things to do today, Jane said, her voice strained but determined. We'll work on your science project together when we get home. But you don't know how to make a volcano, Katie whined. Then we'll figure it out together, Jane said, and I heard an echo of strength in her voice that reminded me of the little girl who'd made that lopsided birthday cake. They gathered their things and headed toward the door, the children complaining loudly about the disruption to their routine. Donald lingered behind. Mom, he said, and his voice was thick with emotion. I'm sorry. I'm sorry we took you for granted. I'm sorry we made you feel like you didn't matter except for what you could do for us. I felt my own eyes fill with tears, but I blinked them back. I'd cried enough tears over the years, mourning the woman I'd been before I became everyone's solution to everything. I know you are, I said. And I love you both, more than you'll ever know. But love isn't enough anymore. I need to save what's left of myself before it's too late. He nodded, though I could see he didn't really understand. How could he? He'd never been in my position, never felt himself disappearing piece by piece until there was nothing left but the roles he played for other people. Will you call? He asked. Will you let us know where you are, that you're okay? Eventually, I said. When I'm ready. When I've figured out who I am, when I'm not being your mother or their grandmother or anyone's caretaker. He hugged me then, a real hug, not the perfunctory embrace we usually shared. I could feel him trembling, and I realized that maybe, for the first time in years, he was seeing me as a person rather than just a function. I love you, Mom, he whispered. I love you too, I whispered back. That's why I have to do this. After they left, the house felt different. Quieter, but not in a peaceful way. It was the quiet of a held breath, of a pause before something momentous happened. I walked through the rooms, looking at the life I was about to leave behind. The kitchen where I'd cooked thousands of meals, most of them for other people. The living room where I'd hosted countless family gatherings, always playing the role of hostess while everyone else relaxed and enjoyed themselves. The bedroom I'd shared with my husband for 23 years, where I'd slept alone for the past 3 years since his death. In my bedroom, 2 suitcases sat on the bed, packed with the essentials of a life I was about to begin. Clothes, toiletries, a few precious photographs, the journal I'd been keeping secretly for the past 5 years. Everything else could be replaced or left behind. I picked up the journal and flipped through its pages, reading entries that chronicled my slow awakening to the reality of my situation. The day I'd realized that my children only called when they needed something. The day I'd understood that my grandchildren saw me as a source of entertainment and snacks rather than a person with feelings and needs. The day I'd admitted to myself that I was desperately unhappy and had been for years. The final entry was from last week. I am 65 years old, and I have been living someone else's life for so long that I've forgotten what my own dreams look like. Tomorrow, I will tell them I'm leaving. Tomorrow, I will choose myself for the first time in 43 years. I am terrified and exhilarated and heartbroken all at once. But I am also, finally, alive. I closed the journal and placed it back in the suitcase. Tomorrow morning, I would load these bags into my car and drive away from everything I'd ever known. I had no destination in mind, no plan beyond the need to discover who I was when I wasn't being everything to everyone. The phone rang, and I knew without looking that it would be Jane or Donald, calling to try one more time to talk me out of my decision. I let it ring. I'd said everything I needed to say. Instead, I made myself a simple dinner, just for me, just what I wanted, and ate it in peaceful silence. Then I sat in my favorite chair with a cup of tea and watched the sun set through the window, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink that reminded me of possibilities I'd forgotten existed. As darkness fell, I thought about the woman I'd been before I became a mother, before I learned to define myself entirely through my relationships with other people. She'd been curious about the world, eager to learn new things, unafraid of taking risks. She'd had dreams that didn't revolve around anyone else's needs or expectations. Tomorrow, I will go looking for her. And maybe, if I was very lucky, I would find her waiting for me somewhere down the road, ready to show me what the rest of my life could look like if I had the courage to live it for myself. The grandfather clock chimed 10 times, and I realized I should probably get some sleep. Tomorrow would be a long day, the first day of whatever came next. But as I started to get up from my chair, I heard a car pulling into the driveway. Then another. And another. I walked to the window and peered out through the curtains. Donald's truck was back, along with Jane's minivan and 2 other cars I didn't recognize. As I watched, my children got out of their vehicles, followed by people I slowly recognized as my neighbors, my co-workers from the library, even my doctor. They were all walking toward my front door with determined expressions on their faces, and I realized that my quiet evening was about to become something else entirely. The doorbell rang, followed immediately by loud knocking. "Mom!" Jane's voice called through the door. "We know you're in there. We need to talk." I stood frozen in my living room, my heart pounding. This wasn't how I'd imagined my last night in this house would go. I'd pictured quiet reflection, maybe some packing, and an early bedtime before my journey into the unknown. Instead, it seemed like half the town had gathered on my doorstep, and from the sound of their voices, they weren't planning to leave anytime soon. The knocking grew more insistent, and I heard Donald's voice join Jane's. "Mom, please. Just hear us out. We brought some people who want to talk to you." I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. Whatever was about to happen, whatever they thought they could say to change my mind, I had to stay strong. I had to remember why I was doing this, what was at stake if I let them pull me back into the life that was slowly killing me. But as I walked toward the door, my hand trembling on the doorknob, I couldn't help wondering, what if they were right? What if I was being selfish? What if leaving really would destroy the people I loved most in the world? The knocking stopped, and in the sudden silence, I could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. Then Jane's voice came through the door, softer now, almost pleading. "Mom, please. We brought Dr. Martinez. And Mrs. Thompson from the library. And the Hendersons from next door. They all want to tell you something. Something we should have told you years ago." I pressed my forehead against the cool wood of the door, torn between curiosity and the fear that whatever they had to say would weaken my resolve. 5 minutes, I called through the door. "That's all. That's all we need," Donald's voice replied. I unlocked the door and opened it to find myself facing a small crowd of people, all looking at me with expressions I couldn't quite read. Concern, yes, but something else too. Something that looked almost like. But that was impossible. Wasn't it? I opened the door wider, and they filed into my living room like mourners at a wake. Dr. Martinez, who had been my physician for 15 years. Mrs. Thompson, my supervisor at the library where I'd worked part-time for the past decade. The Hendersons from next door, who I'd helped through countless emergencies over the years. Even Father Mackenzie from the church I attended sporadically was there, his collar slightly askew as if he'd been called away from dinner. They arranged themselves around my living room, some sitting, others standing awkwardly near the walls. Donald and Jane positioned themselves by the door, as if they were afraid I might bolt at any moment. Which, honestly, wasn't entirely wrong. "What is this?" I asked, my voice sharper than I'd intended. "Some kind of intervention?" Dr. Martinez stepped forward, his kind eyes serious behind wire-rimmed glasses. "In a way, yes. But not the kind you're thinking of." He pulled a folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket and cleared his throat. 3 months ago, he began, I was having lunch with my wife when she asked me something that stopped me cold. She asked me if I knew anyone who truly embodied the spirit of selfless service. Without hesitation, I said your name. I felt heat rise in my cheeks. "Dr. Martinez, this isn't necessary." "Please," he said gently. "Let me finish." That conversation led to another, and before I knew it, I was part of a group of people who had all been touched by your kindness in ways you probably don't even remember. Mrs. Thompson stepped forward next, her usually stern expression softened by something that looked like affection. "Do you remember last winter when my husband had his heart attack?" she asked. "You weren't scheduled to work that day, but when you heard what happened, you came in anyway. You covered my shifts for 2 weeks, no questions asked, no complaints. You brought meals to the hospital. You even walked our dog when we couldn't get home." "That's what neighbors do," I said quietly, but she shook her head. "No, that's what you do. Most people would have sent a card, maybe brought a casserole. You reorganized your entire life to help us through the worst 2 weeks of our marriage." Mr. Henderson cleared his throat, his weathered hands clasped in front of him. "When our grandson came to live with us after his parents died," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "we were terrified. We were in our 70s, trying to raise a traumatized 8-year-old boy. You didn't just help with babysitting or homework. You researched child psychologists, you found support groups for grieving children, you even learned about video games so you could connect with him." His wife nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Tommy calls you his guardian angel. He's 17 now, about to graduate high school with honors, and he says it's because you believed in him when he couldn't believe in himself." I felt my carefully constructed resolve beginning to crack. These weren't the voices of people who saw me as a convenient resource. These were people who saw me as, what? What was I hearing in their voices? Father Mackenzie stepped forward, his usually jovial face serious. "I've been a priest for 32 years, he said. I've seen a lot of people who talk about Christian charity, about loving their neighbors as themselves. But I've rarely seen someone who lives it as completely as you do. The number of families you've helped through crises, the meals you've cooked for new mothers, the elderly parishioners you've driven to appointments when they couldn't drive themselves. I just did what needed to be done," I protested, but my voice sounded weak even to my own ears. "Exactly," said a voice from the back of the room. I turned to see Maria Santos, a young woman I'd helped when she was a struggling single mother 5 years ago. "You saw what needed to be done, and you did it. No fanfare, no expectation of recognition or reward. You just helped." She stepped closer, and I could see that she was holding a manila folder. "When Donald and Jane told us you were leaving because you felt unappreciated, we couldn't believe it. So we decided to show you something." She opened the folder and pulled out what looked like dozens of letters, cards, and photographs. "These are from people whose lives you've touched," she said. "People you probably don't even remember helping. The teenage mother you tutored in math so she could get her GED. The elderly man whose groceries you carried when his arthritis was flaring. The family whose house fire you organized relief efforts for. She handed me one of the letters, and I recognized the handwriting immediately. It was from Sarah, a young woman who had worked at the library briefly 2 years ago. Dear Mrs. Patterson, it read. I know you probably don't remember me, but I was the girl who was always crying in the break room at the library. I was going through a terrible divorce, struggling to support my 2 kids, and I felt like my world was falling apart. You never asked intrusive questions or offered advice I didn't want. You just quietly made sure I had lunch every day, covered for me when I had to leave early for court dates, and somehow always knew exactly what to say to make me feel less alone. I'm remarried now, happy, and my kids are thriving. I wanted you to know that your kindness during the darkest period of my life literally saved me. You are an angel walking among us. My hands were shaking as I finished reading. Maria handed me another letter, then another. Each one told a similar story of quiet kindness, of help given without expectation of return, of a woman who had touched lives in ways she'd never fully understood. There are 47 letters here, Maria said softly. 47 people who wanted you to know that you matter, that your life has meaning beyond what you do for your immediate family. I sank into my chair, the letters scattered across my lap like fallen leaves. Around me, the room was silent except for the ticking of that grandfather clock and the sound of my own ragged breathing. I don't understand, I whispered. If all of this is true, if I've helped so many people, then why do I feel so empty? Why do I feel like I'm disappearing? Dr. Martinez knelt beside my chair, his voice gentle. Because there's a difference between being appreciated and being seen, he said. These people see you, recognize your worth, understand the impact you've had on their lives. But the people closest to you, the ones whose opinions matter most, have taken your kindness for granted for so long that they've forgotten to see the person behind the service. He glanced at Donald and Jane, who were both crying now. That doesn't make you less valuable, he continued. It just means that the people who should have been telling you these things every day forgot to do it. Jane stepped forward, her face streaked with tears. We did forget, she said, her voice breaking. We got so used to you being there, being strong, being the one who fixed everything, that we forgot you were a person who needed to be appreciated too. Donald nodded, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. We treated you like you were invincible, he said. Like you didn't have feelings or needs or dreams of your own. We were so focused on what you could do for us that we never stopped to think about what we could do for you. I looked around the room at all these faces, some familiar, some not, all looking at me with expressions of genuine care and concern. It was overwhelming and confusing and heartbreaking all at once. But that doesn't change anything, I said finally. It doesn't change the fact that I've lost myself somewhere along the way. It doesn't change the fact that I need to figure out who I am when I'm not being everything to everyone. Mrs. Thompson stepped forward again. What if you didn't have to choose? She asked. What if there was a way to rediscover yourself without abandoning everyone who needs you? What do you mean? She exchanged glances with Dr. Martinez, and I got the feeling that this conversation had been planned, rehearsed even. What if, she said carefully, instead of running away from your life, you redesigned it? What if you set boundaries, established limits, created space for yourself while still being available to help others in a way that doesn't consume you? That's what I tried to tell them earlier, I said, gesturing toward Donald and Jane. But they don't understand. They think family means being available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, for whatever crisis or convenience they need. Then maybe, said Father Mackenzie, it's time for all of us to learn a new way of loving each other. A way that honors your needs as much as it honors theirs. I felt a flicker of something that might have been hope, but I pushed it down. I'd been disappointed too many times before. It sounds nice in theory, I said. But people don't really change. They might try for a while, but eventually they fall back into old patterns. "You're right," said a voice from the doorway. I turned to see Harold, the man I'd been having coffee with occasionally over the past few months. He was holding a bouquet of flowers and looking uncertain about whether he should come in. "Harold," I said, surprised. "What are you doing here?" "Donald called me," he said, stepping into the room. He thought I might have something to add to this conversation. He handed me the flowers, daisies, my favorites, though I'd never told him that, and sat down on the arm of my chair. "You're right that people don't usually change," he said. "But sometimes, when they're faced with the possibility of losing something precious, they find the motivation they never had before." He looked around the room at the assembled group. "I've been watching you for months," he said, trying to work up the courage to ask you out properly. "And what I've seen is a woman who gives so much of herself to others that there's barely anything left for her own happiness. I've wanted to tell you that you deserve more, that you deserve to be cherished and appreciated, not just used." My heart was beating so fast I was sure everyone could hear it. "But I also know," he continued, "that you can't just walk away from who you are. You're a helper, a caretaker, someone who sees a need and responds to it. That's not a weakness, it's a gift. The problem isn't that you care too much. The problem is that the people closest to you have forgotten to care for you in return." He turned to face Donald and Jane directly. "So the question is," he said, "are you willing to learn? Are you willing to change the way you relate to your mother so that she can be both the caring person she's always been and the individual woman she deserves to be?" Donald stepped forward, his face earnest. "Yes," he said without hesitation. "Whatever it takes. I don't want to lose you, Mom, but more than that, I don't want to keep hurting you." Jane nodded vigorously. "We'll do better," she said. "We'll learn to ask instead of assuming, to give instead of just taking, to see you as a person instead of just a resource." I wanted to believe them. God, how I wanted to believe them. But I'd heard promises before, seen good intentions crumble under the weight of old habits and new crises. "How?" I asked. "How do we change patterns that have been in place for decades?" Dr. Martinez pulled out another piece of paper. "We've been talking about that," he said. "And we have some ideas." He unfolded what looked like a contract, with multiple signatures at the bottom. "This is a commitment," he said, "signed by everyone in this room. A promise to support you in creating the life you want while still being part of the community that needs you." I took the paper and read the first few lines. "We, the undersigned, recognize that we have taken advantage of the kindness and generosity of a remarkable woman. We commit to supporting her in establishing healthy boundaries, pursuing her own interests, and living a life that honors her needs as well as her desire to help others." The document went on to outline specific commitments. Donald and Jane would schedule their requests for help in advance instead of expecting immediate availability. They would reciprocate by offering their own assistance with tasks I needed help with. They would respect my right to say no without guilt or manipulation. The others had made their own commitments. Mrs. Thompson promised to hire additional part-time help at the library so I wouldn't feel obligated to cover every emergency. The Hendersons offered to help with yard work and home maintenance. Father Mackenzie suggested I consider leading a support group for caregivers, turning my experience into a way to help others while also processing my own feelings. At the bottom of the page, Harold had written, "I promise to remind you daily that you are valued for who you are, not just what you do." I stared at the paper, overwhelmed by the thought and care that had gone into creating it. These people had listened to my children's panicked explanation of why I was leaving, and instead of dismissing my feelings or trying to guilt me into staying, they had worked together to find a solution that honored everyone's needs. "This is..." I started, then stopped, not sure how to finish the sentence. "It's a beginning," Harold said softly. "Not a guarantee, but a commitment to try something different." I looked around the room again, seeing these familiar faces in a new light. They weren't here to manipulate me or guilt me into staying. They were here because they genuinely cared about my well-being, because they saw value in who I was as a person. What if it doesn't work? I asked. What if we try this and fall back into the same old patterns? Then we try again, Jane said firmly. And again, until we get it right. Because losing you isn't an option. Donald nodded. We'll mess up, probably more than once. But we'll keep working at it because you're worth the effort. I felt tears starting to flow, but for the first time in years, they weren't tears of frustration or exhaustion. They were tears of something that felt dangerously close to hope. I need time to think, I said finally. This is all so overwhelming, and I can't make a decision this big when I'm this emotional. Of course, Dr. Martinez said, standing up. Take all the time you need. We'll be here when you're ready. One by one, they filed out of my house, each person stopping to hug me or squeeze my hand or whisper words of encouragement. Harold was the last to leave, and he paused at the door. Whatever you decide, he said, I want you to know that meeting you has been one of the best things that's happened to me in years. You've reminded me what it looks like to live with an open heart. After everyone left, I sat alone in my living room, surrounded by the letters and the contract and the lingering scent of Harold's flowers. The house felt different now, charged with possibility in a way it hadn't been in years. I picked up one of the letters and read it again, then another, then another. Each one painted a picture of a woman I barely recognized, someone strong and compassionate and valuable, someone whose life had meaning beyond the role she played for her immediate family. Was it possible that I had been looking at my life through the wrong lens? Was it possible that I wasn't disappearing at all, but rather that I had been so focused on what I wasn't getting from my children that I had missed what I was giving to the world? I walked to the mirror in the hallway and looked at my reflection. The woman staring back at me looked tired, yes, but not defeated. There was something in her eyes that I hadn't seen in years, a spark of curiosity, of possibility, of hope. Maybe I didn't need to run away to find myself. Maybe I just needed to learn how to stay while still honoring who I was becoming. But as I stood there contemplating this new possibility, my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but something compelled me to answer. Hello? Is this Vanessa Patterson? The voice was young, female, and shaking with emotion. Yes, this is Vanessa. My name is Amanda. Amanda Rodriguez. I got your number from Mrs. Thompson at the library. She said you might be able to help me. I felt my heart sink. Here it was again. Someone else who needed something from me, someone else who saw me as a solution to their problems. What kind of help do you need? I asked, trying to keep the weariness out of my voice. It's my daughter, Amanda said, and I could hear her crying now. She's only 16, and she's pregnant, and she's talking about not keeping the baby. But she's scared and confused, and I don't know how to help her. Mrs. Thompson said you helped her niece through something similar a few years ago. I closed my eyes, feeling the familiar tug of someone else's crisis pulling at me. This was exactly what I was trying to escape, the endless cycle of other people's emergencies becoming my responsibility. But then I thought about the letters scattered across my coffee table, about the faces of all those people who had been in this room tonight, about the difference between being used and being needed. Amanda, I said gently, I'm going through some personal challenges right now, and I'm not sure I'm the right person to help you. There was silence on the other end of the line, and I could hear her trying to muffle her sobs. I'm sorry, she said finally. I shouldn't have called. It's just. Mrs. Thompson made it sound like you were someone who cared about people like us. Something in her voice, the resignation, the defeat, the assumption that she was asking too much, reminded me of myself just a few hours ago. Here was someone who felt alone and overwhelmed, someone who needed not just help but hope. Wait, I said before she could hang up. Don't apologize. You're not asking too much. It's complicated. I walked back to the living room and looked at the contract still lying on my coffee table, at Harold's promise to remind me that I was valued for who I was, not just what I did. "Can I ask you something, Amanda?" "Of course. If I help you and your daughter, if I spend time listening and offering support and connecting you with resources, what would that mean to you? Not what would you get out of it, but what would it mean that someone cared enough to help?" She was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was thick with emotion. "It would mean that we weren't alone," she said. "It would mean that someone saw us as worth saving." I felt something shift inside me, a recognition that maybe the problem wasn't that I helped people, but that I had been helping the wrong people in the wrong ways for the wrong reasons. "Amanda," I said, "I think I might be able to help you. But I need to be honest, I'm going through some changes in my life right now, and I can't be available 24 hours a day. I can offer support and guidance, but you and your daughter will need to do the hard work yourselves." "That's all we're asking for," she said, and I could hear the relief in her voice. "Just someone who believes we can figure this out." As I hung up the phone, I realized that something fundamental had shifted in my understanding of myself and my place in the world. I wasn't a victim of other people's needs, I was someone who had the power to choose how and when and why I helped others. The question was, what was I going to choose? I looked at the suitcases still sitting on my bed, packed and ready for a journey into the unknown. Then I looked at the contract on my coffee table, with its promises of a different kind of life, one where I could be both the helper I'd always been and the individual I was still becoming. Tomorrow, I will have to decide which path to take. But tonight, for the first time in years, I felt like I actually had a choice. And then, just as I was about to turn off the lights and go to bed, I heard a car door slam outside. Then another. And another. I walked to the window and peered out through the curtains, my heart sinking as I saw what was waiting for me in the driveway. 3 police cars, their red and blue lights flashing silently in the darkness. And standing beside them, talking animatedly to the officers, were Donald and Jane. But they weren't alone. There was someone else with them, someone I hadn't seen in over 2 years, someone whose presence here could only mean one thing. My ex-sister-in-law, Isabel, had come back to town. And if Isabel was here, talking to the police about me, then everything I thought I understood about this situation was about to change in ways I couldn't even begin to imagine. I stood frozen at the window, watching Isabel gesture dramatically toward my house while speaking to the police officers. Even in the dim light from the street lamps, I could see her perfectly styled hair and expensive coat. She always knew how to make an entrance. Isabel had been married to my late husband's brother for 15 years before their bitter divorce 2 years ago. She'd always resented what she called my saint act, claiming I made other women in the family look bad by comparison. When she left town after the divorce, I'd hoped never to see her again. Now here she was, apparently leading some kind of intervention with law enforcement. I watched Donald approach one of the officers, his hands moving in what looked like apologetic gestures. Jane stood beside him, her arms wrapped around herself against the cold night air. Whatever Isabel had told them, it was serious enough to bring the police to my door at nearly 11 o'clock at night. The doorbell rang, followed by a firm knock. "Mrs. Patterson. This is Officer Martinez with the Evansville Police Department. We need to speak with you, please." I took a deep breath and opened the door. 3 officers stood on my porch, along with Donald, Jane, and Isabel, who was wearing a triumphant expression that made my stomach clench. "Good evening, officers," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Is there a problem?" The lead officer, a middle-aged Hispanic man with kind eyes, stepped forward. "Ma'am, we received a call expressing concern about your welfare. May we come in?" I glanced at Isabel, who was practically vibrating with self-satisfaction. "Of course," I said, stepping aside to let them enter. We all crowded into my living room, where the letters from earlier were still scattered across the coffee table. Isabel's eyes immediately zeroed in on them, and I saw her expression shift from triumph to confusion. "Mrs. Patterson," Officer Martinez began, "we received a call from Ms. Isabel Hendricks here, claiming that you were being held against your will by family members who were trying to prevent you from leaving town. I blinked in surprise. I'm sorry, what? Isabel stepped forward, her voice taking on the dramatic tone I remembered so well. Vanessa, don't try to protect them. I know what Donald and Jane have been doing to you. I know they've been manipulating you, making you feel guilty for wanting to live your own life. When I heard you were trying to leave and they were stopping you, I knew I had to intervene. I stared at her, genuinely bewildered. Isabel, I have no idea what you're talking about. The intervention, she said, gesturing wildly. All those people here tonight, pressuring you to stay, making you feel guilty for wanting freedom. It's emotional abuse, Vanessa, and I won't stand by and watch it happen. Officer Martinez looked between us, clearly trying to piece together what was actually happening. Ma'am, he said to me, are you being coerced or threatened in any way? Are you free to leave if you choose to? Yes, of course I am, I said. I'm not being held against my will. This is all a misunderstanding. Isabel's face flushed red. Don't lie to protect them, Vanessa. I saw all those cars here tonight. I saw the crowd of people. They were obviously pressuring you to stay. Donald stepped forward, his face pale with exhaustion and stress. Officer, my aunt is confused about the situation. Yes, there were people here tonight, but they came to support my mother, not to coerce her. She's been planning to leave town, and we were trying to understand why and see if there was a way to work things out. Is this true, Mrs. Patterson? Officer Martinez asked. I looked around the room at the faces staring back at me, the police officers doing their job, Donald and Jane looking terrified and exhausted, and Isabel looking increasingly frustrated that her dramatic rescue wasn't going according to plan. Yes, it's true, I said. I've been feeling unappreciated by my family, and I was planning to leave town tomorrow to start fresh somewhere else. Tonight, my children brought some friends and neighbors here to talk to me about it. No one forced me to do anything. Isabel's mouth fell open. But Donald called me. He was panicking, saying you were leaving and he didn't know what to do. He sounded desperate. Donald ran his hands through his hair. I called you because I was upset and confused, Aunt Isabel. I thought maybe you could help me understand what I'd done wrong. I never asked you to call the police. You said your mother was acting irrationally, that she was abandoning her family for no good reason, Isabel protested. I was wrong, Donald said quietly. I was scared and selfish, and I said things I shouldn't have said. But Mom isn't acting irrationally. She's been trying to tell us for years that she needed more from us, and we weren't listening. Officer Martinez looked at me again. Mrs. Patterson, just to be absolutely clear, you're not in any danger, you're not being threatened or coerced, and you're free to make your own decisions about where you live and how you spend your time. That's correct, I said firmly. He nodded and closed his notebook. Then I think we're done here. Ms. Hendricks, while we appreciate your concern for Mrs. Patterson's welfare, it appears there's been a misunderstanding. Mrs. Patterson is a competent adult who's free to make her own choices. Isabel looked like she'd been slapped. But what about the emotional manipulation? What about them making her feel guilty for wanting to live her own life? That's a family matter, Officer Martinez said gently. Not a legal one. As long as no one is being threatened or physically prevented from leaving, adults are free to work out their relationships however they see fit. The officers prepared to leave, but Isabel wasn't finished. Vanessa, she said, her voice taking on a wheedling tone, you don't have to stay here and put up with this. Come with me. I have a spare room in my apartment in Chicago. You can start fresh there, away from all this family drama. I looked at her, really looked at her, and suddenly understood what was happening. Isabel had always been jealous of the close relationship I'd had with my husband's family, even when that closeness had become suffocating. She'd seen Donald's panicked phone call as an opportunity to swoop in and play the hero, to finally be the one who saved the day. Isabel, I said gently, I appreciate your concern, but I don't need to be rescued. I need to figure out how to live my life in a way that honors both my desire to help others and my need to be valued as an individual. But they'll never change, she said desperately. They'll promise to do better, but in a few weeks or months, they'll go right back to taking you for granted. I glanced at Donald and Jane, who were watching this exchange with expressions of growing understanding. Maybe, I said. But maybe not. And either way, that's my choice to make. Isabel stared at me for a long moment, then shook her head in disgust. Fine, she said. Stay here and let them walk all over you. But don't come crying to me when you realize I was right. She stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind her. The police officers followed more quietly, Officer Martinez pausing to hand me his card. If you ever do need help, Mrs. Patterson, don't hesitate to call, he said. After they left, the three of us stood in my living room in awkward silence. Finally, Jane spoke. I'm sorry, Mom. I had no idea Donald had called Isabel, and I certainly didn't know she was going to involve the police. Donald looked miserable. I was panicking after our conversation earlier. I called her because I thought she might have some insight into why you were so unhappy. I never imagined she'd do something like this. I sank into my chair, suddenly feeling every one of my 65 years. This is exactly what I'm talking about, I said wearily. Even when I try to have an honest conversation about my needs, it turns into drama and chaos and other people making decisions about what's best for me. You're right, Donald said, sitting down across from me. And I'm sorry. I should have respected your decision and worked on myself instead of trying to find someone else to fix the situation. Jane nodded. We keep doing it, don't we? We keep treating you like a problem to be solved instead of a person to be heard. I looked at my children, really looked at them, and saw something I hadn't noticed before. They weren't just selfish and demanding. They were scared. Scared of losing me, scared of having to face their own inadequacies, scared of a world where they couldn't count on their mother to make everything okay. I'm scared too, I said softly. I'm scared that if I stay, nothing will really change. I'm scared that if I leave, I'll regret it for the rest of my life. I'm scared that I've waited too long to figure out who I am outside of being your mother. We sat in silence for a moment, and then Jane did something she hadn't done since she was a little girl. She came over and curled up on the floor beside my chair, resting her head against my knee. Tell us about your dreams, she said quietly. The ones you had before we came along and took over your life. I was so surprised by the question that I didn't answer right away. I mean it, she continued. I realized tonight that I know almost nothing about who you were before you became our mom. What did you want to do with your life? What made you happy? Donald leaned forward, his expression genuinely curious. I don't think I've ever asked you that either. I thought about it, reaching back through the years to remember the young woman I'd been before marriage and motherhood had reshaped my identity. I wanted to write, I said finally. I had this idea for a novel about a woman who traveled around the country collecting stories from other women, their dreams, their struggles, their triumphs. I thought it would be a way to honor the experiences that usually go unnoticed. That sounds amazing, Jane said. What happened to it? Life happened, I said with a rueful smile. Your father and I got married, you two came along, and there was always something more pressing than my silly writing dreams. They weren't silly, Donald said firmly. And it's not too late. I looked at him skeptically. I'm 65 years old, Donald. I think the time for chasing dreams has passed. Who? Jane asked. Grandma Moses didn't start painting until she was in her 70s. Laura Ingalls Wilder didn't publish her first Little House book until she was 64. I stared at my daughter, amazed. How do you know that? She smiled sheepishly. I looked it up after Harold mentioned that you deserved to pursue your own interests. I wanted to find examples of women who started new careers later in life, in case you needed encouragement. Something warm and unfamiliar bloomed in my chest. When was the last time one of my children had researched something just to support my dreams? What else did you find? I asked. Lots of things, Donald said, pulling out his phone. I've been doing some research too. There are writing groups for seniors, travel programs for older adults, even grants available for people who want to start creative projects later in life. I felt tears starting to form again, but these were different from the tears I'd shed earlier. These were tears of possibility, of hope, of the radical idea that maybe it wasn't too late to become the person I'd always wanted to be. But what about your needs? I asked. What about the kids, and all the ways you've come to depend on me? We'll figure it out, Jane said. We're adults, Mom. We should have been figuring it out all along. Donald nodded. And we want to help you pursue your dreams, not just expect you to facilitate ours. I looked around my living room, at the letters still scattered on the coffee table, at the contract promising a new way of relating to each other, at my children who were finally seeing me as a whole person rather than just a collection of useful functions. I don't know if I can trust this, I said honestly. I want to believe that things can change, but I've been disappointed so many times. Then don't trust it completely, Jane said. Keep your escape plan. Keep your independence. But maybe give us a chance to prove that we can do better. I thought about the suitcases still packed in my bedroom, about the unknown road I'd been planning to travel, about the woman I'd been trying to find by running away from everything familiar. What if, I said slowly, instead of leaving permanently or staying exactly as things were, we tried something different? What do you mean? Donald asked. What if I took that trip I've been planning, but not as an escape? What if I went to collect those stories I always wanted to write about, and you two proved you could manage your lives without me for a few months? Jane sat up straighter. Like a trial separation. More like a sabbatical, I said. A chance for me to remember who I am when I'm not being needed every minute, and a chance for you to remember that you're capable of handling your own lives. Donald was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. I think that could work. How long were you thinking? 3 months, I said. Long enough for real change to happen, but not so long that it feels like abandonment. And then you'd come back? Jane asked. I'd come back to see how things had changed, I said carefully. For all of us. We talked for another hour, working out the details of what this sabbatical might look like. In return, I would stay in touch, send postcards and emails about my travels, and come back with stories to share. I would write the book I'd always dreamed of writing, and they would be the first to read it. As we talked, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, excitement about the future. Not the anxious excitement of wondering what crisis would need solving next, but the pure joy of anticipating new experiences and possibilities. There's one more thing, I said as we prepared to say goodnight. Harold asked me to go to Scotland with him this summer. I'd like to say yes. Donald and Jane exchanged glances, and I braced myself for objections, for reminders of all the reasons I couldn't possibly go gallivanting around Europe with a man I'd only known for a few months. Instead, Jane grinned. Mom, that's wonderful. You deserve to have someone who sees you as more than just a caretaker. And Scotland is supposed to be beautiful, Donald added. You should definitely go. I stared at them, amazed by their response. You're not going to tell me I'm too old, or that it's inappropriate, or that you need me here. We're going to tell you that you're a grown woman who deserves to be happy, Jane said firmly. And if Harold makes you happy, then we're happy for you. As my children prepared to leave, I felt a shift in our relationship that went deeper than words or promises. For the first time in decades, they were seeing me not as their mother first and a person second, but as a complete human being with my own desires, dreams, and right to happiness. I love you both, I said as I hugged them goodbye. And I'm proud of the people you're becoming. We love you too, Mom, Donald said. And we're sorry it took us so long to see what we were doing to you. After they left, I sat alone in my quiet house, but the silence felt different now. It wasn't the silence of isolation or resignation. It was the silence of possibility, of a future that stretched ahead of me filled with adventures I'd never dared to imagine. I walked to my bedroom and looked at the packed suitcases on my bed. Tomorrow, I would still be leaving, but not as a woman running away from her life. I would be leaving as a woman stepping into the next chapter of her story, one where she was the protagonist rather than just a supporting character in everyone else's drama. I picked up my phone and dialed Harold's number. Vanessa. His voice was warm with surprise. Is everything okay? Everything is perfect, I said, and realized I meant it. Harold, about that trip to Scotland. Yes. I'd love to go with you. His delighted laughter filled my ear, and I found myself laughing too, feeling lighter than I had in years. There's something else, I said. I'm going to write a book. About women's stories, their dreams and struggles and triumphs. Would you mind if I interviewed you about your late wife? I think her story deserves to be told. I'd be honored, he said softly. She would have loved knowing that her life mattered to someone else. As I hung up the phone, I realized that I'd found what I'd been looking for all along. Not escape from my life, but transformation of it. Not abandonment of my role as a helper and caretaker, but expansion of that role to include caring for myself. I was still Vanessa Patterson, mother and grandmother, friend and neighbor, helper and supporter. But I was also Vanessa Patterson, writer and traveler, woman and individual, someone whose dreams mattered as much as anyone else's. The next morning, I loaded my suitcases into my car, but instead of driving toward an unknown destination, I drove to the library where Mrs. Thompson was waiting with a stack of books about travel writing and a list of women's shelters and community centers across the country where I might find stories to collect. Are you sure about this? She asked as she helped me load the books into my car. I'm sure, I said, and for the first time in years, I truly was. As I drove out of Evansville that morning, I wasn't running away from my life. I was driving toward it, toward the woman I'd always been underneath all the roles I'd played, toward the dreams I'd deferred but never quite abandoned, toward a future where love and service and self-care could coexist in beautiful, complicated harmony. In my rearview mirror, I could see my hometown growing smaller, but I wasn't sad. I was grateful for the lessons learned, the relationships transformed, and the second chance at becoming who I was always meant to be. The road stretched ahead of me, full of possibilities I was finally brave enough to explore. And for the first time in 43 years, I was driving toward my own new beginning. All I knew was that I was finally, truly, completely alive. And that was enough.